Black driver got his billionaire madam pregnant. She laughed until she saw the baby's face. Humble black driver falls into a secret affair with his billionaire madam, but when she gets pregnant, she mocks and denies him. Everything changes the moment the baby is born, because the child's face reveals a shocking truth no one can ignore. She thought her wealth could hide the truth, but one look at the baby's face exposed everything. It began not in a mansion, nor in a boardroom filled with polished glass and the sound of money moving in silence, but in the silence of a car's back seat. A black sedan glided through the streets of the city every night, carrying a woman who owned more than most people could dream, and driven by a man who had nothing more than his wage, his dignity, and his quiet, unshakable pride. He was a driver. To the world, invisible. To her, essential. Every morning, he rose before dawn, pressing his uniform, shining his shoes until they mirrored his own reflection. His job was not just to carry her from destination to destination. It was to disappear into her world, to be there without ever being seen. But fate does not care for invisibility. The driver's eyes had often caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, her sharp features, her commanding presence, her cold, practiced smile that could bend corporations into submission. She was untouchable, a woman of steel built on wealth and power. And yet, beneath the surface, loneliness clung to her like perfume too strong to ignore. One night, when the rain lashed against the windshield and the city seemed swallowed by darkness, the lines blurred. The car became a confessional, the silence a weight too heavy to bear. That night marked the beginning of something forbidden, an entanglement of desire, secrecy, and danger. The billionaire madam had let the mask slip, and the driver, humble as he was, became more than a servant. But where passion lingers, consequences always wait. Weeks turned into months, and the whispers of their secret grew heavier in her chest. The mirror, once a shield, now became a reminder of what they had done. And then came the truth she tried to bury. She was pregnant. For a woman of her status, it was not supposed to happen this way. In her world, pregnancy was carefully planned, orchestrated, even managed by teams of doctors and strategists. But this was chaos, scandal, humiliation waiting to explode. When the truth unfolded within her body, she did not weep. She laughed, not with joy, but with disbelief and cruelty. To her, the idea was absurd. A billionaire brought down, not by rivals or failed investments, but by her own driver. She denied him. She erased his name from the story. To her, this was an accident to be buried, a stain that could never be allowed to spread. But to him, it was not a stain, it was life. The driver carried the weight in silence, his heart torn between shame and pride. Shame, because the world would mock him, a poor man reaching beyond his place. Pride, because deep within her, his blood now flowed in the veins of an heir who would never be denied. The days turned colder, the months heavier. Rumors swirled in silence, but the truth stayed locked behind her guarded lips. She moved through galas and meetings as though nothing had changed, her face a mask of power. But behind closed doors, the reality of her condition could not be ignored. And still, she refused him. She laughed at the thought that a driver could matter. She believed money could erase blood, that wealth could silence nature itself. But life has a way of demanding recognition. As the pregnancy advanced, shadows grew longer. The mansion, once filled with confidence and arrogance, began to echo with unease. For while she laughed, the driver waited. Silent, patient, unseen. But deep in his heart, he knew what she did not yet realize. No matter how much she denied him, no matter how much she wrapped herself in power, the truth would not stay hidden forever. Because one day soon, the world would see the child's face. And in that face, there would be no denying who the father was. The story was no longer about wealth or poverty, power or servitude. It was about truth, inescapable, undeniable truth, waiting for the right moment to break free. And as the final days of her pregnancy approached, that truth drew closer, like a storm on the horizon, impossible to outrun. The mansion that once stood as a fortress of wealth and pride now trembled under the weight of silence. Curtains remained drawn, phones unanswered, and the woman who had commanded the world found herself prisoner to the quiet ticking of time. The pregnancy she had mocked, dismissed, and denied now pressed against her every breath, forcing her to confront a reality she could no longer hide. When the hour finally came, it was not wrapped in glamour or gilded halls, but in the raw, unforgiving truth of pain. The billionaire madam, who had faced boardrooms with fire in her eyes, now faced something she could not outwit, outspend, or command into obedience. Labor tore through her like a storm breaking glass, stripping away every layer of pride she had built around herself. The house staff whispered outside the room, their faces pale with shock. The idea that their untouchable mistress could be brought low, not by power or scandal, but by the most ancient force of all, birth, was a secret too heavy for them to carry. And among them, the driver stood in the shadows, his face unreadable. He had not been invited, not been acknowledged, but his blood called him there, as though some invisible thread pulled him closer to the moment that would change everything. And then, amid cries and broken breaths, the child entered the world. The room fell silent. Nurses gasped. The billionaire madam, exhausted and trembling, turned her head to look at the life that had been pulled from her body. In that instant, her laughter died. Her denial crumbled. For there, swaddled in trembling hands, was a child whose face carried a truth too sharp to ignore. Skin the color of midnight, eyes that mirrored the driver's, features carved not from her world but from his. The child bore the mark of his father. It was undeniable. The billionaire madam, who had mocked the thought, who had dismissed the driver as nothing, now stared at a reflection of him in the tiny face of her child. And for the first time in her life, she had no words. Her empire of pride, her fortress of denial, shattered with a single look. She turned her face away, but turning could not erase what the world would see. For truth is not erased by silence. It lingers in every glance, every whisper, every heartbeat. The child's very existence was a testament that no wealth could silence. The staff exchanged looks of disbelief, fear, and pity. They had served her for years, watched her rule her world with iron and fire, and now they saw her undone not by rivals, but by her own hidden choices. The whispers began, low and dangerous, slipping like smoke through the walls of the mansion. The driver stood apart, his chest rising with heavy breaths. Pride surged in him, but so did sorrow. He had not asked for revenge, nor for glory. All he had ever held was love, quiet, unspoken, forbidden. And now, through the child's face, his love had been written into the world. A truth no one could deny. But the madam could not bring herself to accept it. Her laughter, once cruel, now turned to silence, and her silence turned to shame. She told herself she could still hide it, that money could bend the story, that power could erase even the clearest truth. She wrapped herself tighter in the illusions of wealth, even as the child's face betrayed her with every glance. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion became a cage of tension. The madam avoided the driver's eyes, avoided her own child's reflection, as though looking would shatter her once more. But the world beyond the walls of her estate was not so blind. Whispers spread, rumors took flight, and the story of a billionaire with a child who looked nothing like her world could no longer be contained. And still, the driver remained silent. He did not boast. He did not claim. He watched from the shadows, carrying his truth in his heart, like a flame waiting for the wind. For he knew what she did not. The world had already seen, and no denial could erase it. The madam fought harder. She clung to her wealth, her image, her desperate laughter, but even she began to feel the weight pressing in. At night, when the mansion was quiet and the city slept, she would look at the child and feel a storm raging inside her. She had mocked him. She had denied him. And yet, here was a piece of him she could never escape. The child grew, even in those early months, stronger and sharper, his features deepening with the undeniable truth of his bloodline. And every day, the madam's mask cracked further. For every glance reminded her of what she had tried so hard to bury, that she had been touched not by an equal in wealth or power, but by the man she believed invisible. And in that truth, she saw not just scandal, but something far greater. Something that terrified her even more than shame. She saw sacrifice. She saw love. She saw a man who had asked for nothing, yet given her everything. A man whose quiet strength was reflected in every breath of their child. And for the first time in her life, She questioned whether power and wealth were worth the cost of denying the very blood that now bound her to him. The mansion stood heavy with silence, but deep within its walls, the storm of truth was far from over. Because the world was watching, and soon, the choice would not be hers to make. The world has a way of pulling hidden truths into the light, no matter how much power tries to bury them. The whispers that began within the walls of the mansion spread like wildfire. At first, it was the servants who noticed. The child's face was not a shadow but a mirror of the driver. Then it was the guests at private gatherings, their polite smiles faltering as their eyes lingered too long on the infant. And soon, the story reached beyond the gates, slipping into the streets, until the city itself hummed with the scandal of a billionaire undone by her own denials. For the madam, it was humiliation sharper than any loss she had ever faced in business. Contracts could be rebuilt, fortunes could be restored, but her image, her pride, her armor of superiority, cracked in ways she could not repair. She had mocked him, denied him, erased him in her heart. But now, each time she held her child, she held a truth she could never erase. The driver, meanwhile, bore the storm in silence. He never demanded his place. He never shouted his claim. He carried himself with the same dignity that had defined his life long before wealth or scandal had ever touched him. He worked, he endured, and he waited. For him, the child was not leverage or victory. It was love, a living, breathing testament that even the lowliest could leave a mark on the highest. But the world did not let it rest. The media, hungry for scandal, painted stories of betrayal and disgrace. Business rivals whispered, eager to see the billionaire fall. And the child, too young to know the weight of his existence, became the center of a battle between denial and truth. It was in this storm that the driver made his choice. He could have claimed everything, demanded recognition, demanded wealth, demanded a seat at the table of a world that had never welcomed him. But instead, he stepped forward with humility, not for himself, but for the child. He spoke not of scandal, not of revenge, but of responsibility. He offered the one thing the madam had never expected, sacrifice. He told her, not with words but with the strength of his silence, that he did not care for her fortune or her empire. He cared only that his child would never grow up feeling invisible as he had, that his child would walk in the world knowing he was seen, known, and loved. And it was in that sacrifice that the madam's heart began to change. For years she had built walls around herself, walls made of gold and fear, walls so high that no one could touch her. But now she saw a man who had nothing, willing to give everything. She saw in her child's face not shame, but truth. She saw in the driver's silence not weakness, but strength. And for the first time, she began to let the walls fall. It was not an easy transformation. Pride is not surrendered in a single moment. It breaks slowly, painfully, like stone cracking under the weight of time. The madam wrestled with herself, with her shame, with the eyes of the world that now judged her not for her wealth, but for her heart. But every night, when the house was quiet, she looked into her child's face and saw the undeniable bond between father and son. She saw the way the driver lingered at the edges of the room, never demanding, never intruding, but always present. She saw the way his eyes softened when they rested on the child, a love too pure to be denied. And she realized that what she had once laughed at, what she had once mocked, was the very thing her wealth had never been able to buy: unconditional love. The turning point came quietly, not in front of cameras or in boardrooms, but in the silence of her own heart. She chose not to fight the truth anymore. She chose not to hide behind denial. She chose to embrace the very thing she had once feared. And in that choice, redemption was born. The world, once eager to devour her scandal, now watched as the story shifted. The billionaire who had mocked and denied now stood beside the man she had once called invisible. The driver, humble yet unshaken, was no longer a shadow but a pillar in the life of their child. And together, in their brokenness, they built something greater than wealth could ever buy, a family forged in truth. It was not the story she had written for herself, but it was the story life had written for them. And in that story, there was not disgrace, but grace. Not shame, but strength. The child grew, not in the shadows of denial, but in the light of acceptance. He carried in his face the blending of two worlds, wealth and humility, power, and sacrifice. And in him, there was a new legacy, one that could not be measured in dollars or mansions, but in love and truth. For the madam, it was the greatest lesson she had ever learned, that the true measure of worth is not in what you own, but in what you are willing to give. For the driver, it was the reward he had never sought but had always deserved. Not wealth, not power, but recognition, dignity, and the unshakable bond of fatherhood. And so, what began as scandal ended as redemption. The world would always remember the story of the billionaire and her driver, the child whose face revealed the truth, and the love that grew where laughter and denial had once reigned. Because sometimes, the greatest victories are born not in triumph, but in sacrifice. And sometimes, the most unexpected reward is simply to be seen.